this is a relationship that is not getting any easier. And as we look at these comments here, if the U.S. does not hit the brakes, this is Beijing speaking, but continues to speak down the wrong path, no amount of guardrails can prevent derailing, and there will surely be a conflict and confrontation. Is the White House prepared for what might come next here, Ian? And how much of this bluster do you take seriously?
I take seriously the fact that the U.S.-China relationship is in a pretty bad place right now. There's been very limited direct contact over the last 3 years. The pandemic and China's zero COVID response is responsible for most of that. But the reality is you just don't get a lot of real engagement from Chinese officials on Zoom calls. And when they've been talking in their own bubbles, they become more stereotyped, just as we all do when we don't engage directly with people who we don't necessarily trust. So they're coming out of the pandemic, I think, with a more hawkish perspective. The Americans, one of the few things that the Democrats and Republicans agree on is a tougher line policy on China. And even though Biden himself clearly has a long-standing relationship with Xi Jinping, and he wants to, and I've heard this directly from many, many times from the White House, they want to establish a floor under the U.S.-China relationship. They want more stability. Increasingly, Xi Jinping doesn't see it that way. That's a problem. And the bigger statement from Beijing was not from the new foreign minister. It was from Xi himself on Monday, where he directly called out and criticized the United States for a containment policy. And the Chinese president never does that directly. That's unusual. I take notice.
Yeah, I read that on Monday when he directly said the United States, Ian. Is that rhetoric also supposed to be consumed not just for Washington, but also domestically? Are individuals in China getting frustrated with this war of words that they're hearing from Capitol Hill and the White House?
I'm not sure frustrated is the right term. I think they're getting increasingly nationalist/patriotic, as Americans are. They are. I mean, the Chinese media is much more willing today to call out what they see as hypocrisy as well as blemishes on U.S. domestic politics, fentanyl addiction, suicide rates, obesity, criminality, race problems. Historically, 10 years ago, you didn't see much of that domestically in China's press coverage. You see a lot of it now. They'd say, hey, you know, domestic sovereignty. We don't talk about you guys internally. You don't talk about us internally. We don't like it when you do. Increasingly, the coverage that the average Chinese is getting of the United States is very non-nuanced. It's very negative. And that's a real problem because, I mean, ultimately, that means that there's going to be less political interest or demand from the Chinese government. They don't have elections, but they do have constituents. And if they're feeding their constituents an ongoing diet of the Americans are useless and ugly, then the relationship is going to get worse.
Let's zero in a little bit more on what President Xi said, because I'd like to pick up with you on that for a bit here, Ian. Quote,
sure.
That the U.S. is leading a group of nations to, quote, contain, encircle, and suppress China. He called it a challenge of unprecedented severity. To what extent can we compartmentalize this stuff and continue trading with China, or are we beginning to unwind this relationship economically for real?
Look, it's getting harder given statements like that and given policies that we see from the United States and China that are moving away from an extraordinary level of economic interdependence that still defines the relationship. I want to remind you, I'm talking to Bloomberg here, U.S.-China trade levels as of 2022 are at record highs. Right. So it's not like there is suddenly we're going to cut this relationship off. But why is she saying that? Some of it is the expanded military aid as well as boots on the ground advisors of American military in Taiwan. Some of that's that and seeing a change of the status quo, however incremental. But a big piece of it are export controls. I mean, if you look at semiconductors, you look at 5G and Huawei, you look at what is coming down the pike on generative AI, on quantum computing. This is not about the United States trying to outcompete with the Chinese. This is about the Americans trying to contain the Chinese. In other words, trying to make sure that the Chinese do not have access to the top level technology. It doesn't matter if they can pay for it. Doesn't matter if they can subsidize it. America wants to ensure that America's lead in some of those areas is maintained. That means containing and suppressing the Chinese. And the United States getting American allies like Japan, South Korea, the Netherlands, and others to align with the United States and therefore also contain and suppress the Chinese. Now, the Americans are not doing that in every space. You're not doing that with Coca-Cola. Sure. You're not doing that with LVMH, but you are doing it in the commanding heights of the technology economy, which happens to be one of the most critical areas out there. So, I mean, the Chinese they're not just making this stuff up. I mean, this is a strategic policy of the United States government.